Welcome to episode 8 of the Vitruvian Man podcast. This is your host, Vinamre Kasanaa. In this podcast, we cover the intersection of art, science, logic, and imagination. As you already know, this semester we're bringing on some of the best professors that I've had in my university career, some of the professors who've motivated me and mentored me to take up new approaches to visual mediums, communication, and thinking. Without much further ado, I would like to bring to this show my esteemed professor, Professor Charles Merzbacher. He's the film production program head and director at BU. He's also been teaching screen language and production courses at BU that contain everything from film production, directing, screenwriting, and just cinematography. He's also served as the former vice president of Alter Rock Films. His films have been showcased at Chicago International Film Festival, Sundance, the USA Film Festival, and many others. And the last 5 years have been a bit of a tangent because he's been working on the book. It's called The Short Guide to Producing the Practical Essentials of Producing Short Films. And it's already released now, and we've had the pleasure of having a copy right here.
I do have a copy here.
Yeah, so Professor Merzbacher, welcome to the show.
I'm very happy to be here. Can we turn down my headphones just a smidge?
Oh, sure.
That's just
Is it better?
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Perfect.
Okay.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Very happy to be here. Thank you.
Yeah.
So what can we talk about?
Okay, yeah. So, I just want to get down to the first question, which is sort of on everyone's mind when we talk about film. Can we bring it down from the metaphorical ivory tower that it's always in? It's like, oh, we're going to talk about film. Because I received a lot of responses on my Instagram when I talked to people and told them that, hey, I have a film professor coming in, and they were like, how can we produce good content for the visual medium without, having to scratch our heads or having to consult or watch a billion films or having known how to, even produce films?
Well, actually, scratching your head and watching a billion films maybe is a bit much, but watching a lot of films, those are really good things to do.
Okay.
So it's important to think a lot before, filmmaking is complex. It's a complex thing, even if you're making short films, which is what the focus of my book is about. But, there are always a lot of moving parts in making a film. And it's a great deal of effort always to make any kind of film. And so you do have to think a lot before you go out there and do it. But on the other hand, I hope this doesn't sound like somehow a contradiction, but it's also important not to just get lost in navel gazing or overthinking to the point where you don't do it. At some point you have to get up and go make films. But we can talk about the process. But
yeah.
But I do want to stress that the ideas fundamentally are super important. So a film with a great idea or a great story, I'm not saying it's a good thing if it's not beautifully shot, but it's possible still to make an interesting film that's not exquisitely shot or exquisitely edited. But if you have a beautifully shot, beautifully edited film that's completely hollow and has nothing at its core, then that will never work, never.
Yeah.
So the ideas are important.
It's like great execution, but, the missing part is the idea.
So we can talk a lot about, if people want to get into sort of the real technical sort of details, which is very much what I go into the real dense details. That's why, even though it's called The Short Guide, it's a detailed,
pretty thick book.
It's a detailed book.
Yeah.
But we can go there. But at the outset, you just have to have a strong idea. So that means it does mean taking the time to really work. If you're working with scripted material, it means having a script that you've really thought through and worked on. If you're working on a documentary, you have to have a great subject. Yeah.
So one of the things you did in our class when I joined your screen language class, right? You sort of told us that there are virtually no guides on how to produce a short film. Almost all the guides entail how to just make a blockbuster or a feature length film. And for someone who's a student who's starting out and doesn't have the right amount of finances or the resources, you said that this book is going to help people with that. So could you just outline what the book is, what are its contents?
Yeah, there are some very good books about producing, and there are some good filmmaking guides that have in them some good information about producing for student level work or for people who are making shorts. But there wasn't a book that was just dedicated to the challenges of producing, that is to say, overseeing all the logistics that go into making short films. The books that I had found on that kind of topic were always, as you said, they're about making features. I mean, it's a very good book. There's a production handbook that was written by, I believe she was the production coordinator on Titanic. I mean, that's so far beyond the scope of a student film that it's like trying to compare what's going on in your dorm room to space travel. It's just, they're completely different beasts. So anyway, my book really brought it down to the level of what do you really need to know practically to go about making a short film? Because I think what we're talking about here in terms of maybe some of the questions that were posed to you by students and friends, it can be overwhelming when you look at the process and when you go to a movie theater and see a summer blockbuster or something like that, and then you think you want to go do something. It seems like you're so far removed from that enormous, $100 million undertaking.
Right.
And so, we can dial it all back down to the level where there are certain fundamentals that apply to any film, even a 5-minute short film.
Yeah.
And that's really what I focus on.
Okay.
The interesting thing is that even though they seem a world apart, the processes that we use to make a short film are actually the same that are used in professional productions. It's just they're scaled down to a much smaller level. But the steps you have to go through, it's still fundamentally the same process, which is you have crew, you have cast, you have people, maybe you have to put them up, you have to feed them, you have to figure out, then you get to the actual good part, which is where you get to make the film.
Right.
You're on set. What do you shoot first? How long is it going to take to shoot? What sort of equipment do you need? All those things, those apply whether you're James Cameron or me,
Yeah. So that's interesting that you say that, because I think what's happening now, especially with the advent of social media, is that we all have the power of just putting up our phones in our hands and then sort of going on a whim and shooting something and then trying to piece it together. And it has a narrative sometimes, but generally it's sort of just a stream of images and videos, right? Now, for someone who's infatuated with that sort of thing, how can a process like what you mentioned in your book would help them?
Well, it's complicated because one of the funny things is that actually making short films using a phone, you're right, you can shoot a movie with a phone, and actually you can take some pretty nice images with a phone.
Right.
But a phone is set up so that anyone, your grandmother, anybody can make a movie just by pressing the little button. When I say make a movie, they can take a motion picture,
right.
a shot. That's not the same as making a film story, right? For that, we need to edit. We need to have a series of shots that we can cut together and all those sort of things. And the interesting thing is where I said it gets complicated. It's actually quite hard to do that with a cell phone. I mean, it can be done. It's been done by some interesting, Steven Soderbergh's most recent film he shot with iPhones. But most of the people you talk to who actually undertake something like that, they always say they won't do it again. They do it as a sort of experiment, but it's actually hard to do because you don't, in fact, have all the tools you need. You need, to be able to have different types of shots and things like that. And our phones seem to have those bells and whistles, but actually they're pretty limited that way.
Yeah.
So the first thing that has to be said is there's a reason why there's a reason why here at Boston University we have a lot of equipment. We don't expect students to go out and make films with their cell phones because, in fact, there is a certain amount of equipment that's necessary to make movies that have any degree of sophistication.
Right.
So one of the first things you'll notice when you look at sort of your typical YouTube influencer videos and things like that is a lot of times, I mean, they serve their purpose, but they're not cinema. They're not a cinematic experience. They're somebody talking, fixed camera. There are a lot of jump cuts. And if you were to actually sit down and try to watch a movie made that way, it would pretty quickly turn you off, So there is a certain amount of, before we even talk about logistics, if we want to talk about logistics, but
please,
there's a certain amount of, and this is what you and I studied together, we know about, there's a certain grammar that you have to understand, a certain way that shots have to go together, and certain ways we convey information through the screen that's pretty sophisticated. And I think there's a tendency that we all think we kind of know that stuff because we all grew up watching thousands of hours of movies and TV shows and so forth. But the reality is we don't internalize that any more than you do learn how to drive by simply riding in the back of your mother or father's car.
That's why I love that quote, and I keep mentioning that quote that you have down there. So there's a quote that Professor Merzbacher said that's on the walls of our College of Communication, and that is, when it comes to media and culture, do you want to be, a passive consumer or like an active producer? Like, is that even a choice? And it's that same sort of thing, because you've been passively consuming so much media, you have internalized how to consume, but you haven't been able to sort of, detach from it and see the skeleton that holds it all together, the narrative, right? And the moving parts and the things that remain constant.
I mean, it's actually the rare person who can sort of just figure it out on their own. I mean, there are these rare geniuses who sort of they just picked up a camera and went out there and started making movies.
Yeah.
But most of us, there's actually 100 years of knowledge that's been accumulated about the way that we tell stories on the screen, and that stuff is actually fairly. It's a pretty rich grammar. I know that's a scary word. I don't love sitting around studying grammar, but there is a certain grammar to the screen language. And so the first thing that we, obviously first I mentioned you have to have a good idea, but the other thing then you have to have is the language, the ability to convey the idea in cinematic terms. And then you can talk about what kind of camera do you need, how do you need more than one camera, all the technical stuff comes only then.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that, because when I came into your class, I thought the first thing we're going to do is make a film. So I was really excited, and I was, pretty passionate. I had all these ideas about how I was going to just go out on a whim and start shooting stuff. And then the first thing you said is, we're going to shoot pictures. And these pictures are going to have a montage. They're going to be connected together. Then you said, we're going to shoot portraits. Then you said, okay, now record some sound. Then you said, okay, you've done all of these things. Let's now make a film that now that you've learned all these tools, which is, sort of the building blocks of what a grammar of something like the complex idea of making a film looks like. It's not just you just go out on a whim and you start shooting. And like you said, there are some geniuses who can do that. But for the layman, you have to learn the building blocks. So could you talk more about just the contents of your book briefly? Like, what does it entail? And
well, so the book is very much about, I guess we've sort of gotten to the stage in the whole process where the book would come into play. That is to say, let's assume that you've got an idea you're passionate about. Let's assume that you've maybe on your own or gone to some kind of film school and you've studied some of the film language. You've assimilated some of the ideas about how to tell a story in audiovisual terms. So now it's time to make a movie. I mentioned that the logistics of making a blockbuster are not actually so different from making a short film. They're just, it's a much smaller scale. But, the issues remain the same, which is you've only got so much time, only so much money. You have to figure out what order to shoot things in and so forth. Those problems existed back even 100 years ago in the silent movie days. And in fact, there were a number of clever filmmakers who back roughly 100 years ago started to come up with systems for how to organize film productions. And we still pretty much follow in their footsteps. There's lots of variation in terms of how people do these things. I'm talking about all the planning, the scheduling, the budgeting, the accounting for all the elements that go into a production.
The pre-production process.
The pre-production process, and also managing the production.
Okay.
All that stuff was pretty much, invented, if you will, by people almost 100 years ago, and we've been sort of following that in one form or another with certain additions over time. So my book applies those professional production management methods to making a short film. So we start with a script. We break the script down in terms of the production elements. That's to say, what kind of cast requirements do we have, vehicle requirements, props, wardrobe, makeup, special effects, all the elements that are needed to tell the story. They're all identified in the script, broken down. Then that stuff is put into forms so you have some way to keep track of it all.
Yeah.
And then you can start talking about the schedule. You put your scenes into schedule, a certain order in which you plan to shoot them. And there's a I don't want to get too deep into it, but there's a whole system for thinking that through. And then once you have, because time is money, you can only really do your budget once you have your schedule.
Yeah.
Because how many days you're shooting, how many people are going to be on set and so forth, all the money stuff is all dictated by how much stuff do you have.
Yeah, it's like if you have an outdoor location called Roads, then how many days do you need that location for, and which actor do you need that for, and how many minutes is one scene going to take? I did some of that as a casting director in Mumbai, so
there you go.
Yeah.
But I mean, also, if you're shooting on a road, do you have to close the road off? In which case, you have to have a police permit, and you have to have police officers that you're paying, and so forth. I mean, all those things, and then, like you say, how many days? So your budget is going to be determined by your schedule. By schedule, I don't just mean the basic blunt issues of how many days are you shooting, but I'm talking about all those nitty-gritty details. I'm talking about how many people, how much equipment, what kind of equipment, props, etc. It's all those things. So, and then once you get to that stage, then there's the actual operation of the shoot. You know, there's a lot of just keeping track of all the moving parts is a complicated process.
Right.
And then finally, something that a lot of people don't think of as being necessarily so actively the part of the producer, but I think for short films it absolutely is, and that is the editing and post-production and then the distribution of the film. Really, ultimately, any good producer of a short, I think, is going to have to see a project all the way through. And so there's a lot of things that you have to do that go beyond the shoot. Actually, one of the biggest mistakes beginning filmmakers make is that they spend all their money just getting the film shot, and then they get to the editing stage, not realizing that some of the most costly processes actually come very late. They come at the end of the process, and then you have to get your film out into the world, and you know, there are other options other than just throwing it up on YouTube. So, and all those things take time and money. So the book goes over all that whole arc of from the very beginning. Okay, you've got an idea, a script, and all the way to the end, which is getting it out into the world.
Great. So you guys can buy this book on Amazon or on Focal Press. We'll have a link down here. But like we can come and reference it again and again throughout the discussion. But I did want to pick your brain on something that one of my friends asked me, is like, because I told him that I take this class, screen language. He said, okay, screen language, does it have to do with narrative? I was like, of course, there's a lot of narrative that goes into making films, right? And even something as simple as making a photo montage. So he asked me this question. He said, ask your professor, what's the best story he's ever heard? And it's such a out of left field question, so I just wanted to clear that away.
Man, the best story I've ever heard.
It could just be on screen, or it could be oral.
That's like one of those questions, one of the questions as a filmmaker we always get asked, film professor especially. You're at some
film?
party, what's your favorite film? And I always am like, man, I wouldn't be in this field if I only had one favorite. That really, think about it. Why would you be in the field if you only like really one film above all the others? So there's so many that I love. But that's what I immediately thought of, was I thought like, okay, what are some of the films that I absolutely love? Because I have answers that I give people, and usually, to be honest,
it's like your templates that you've already designed. In your head.
Yeah, true. But the other reason I'm being a little provocative, like when someone asks me what my favorite film is, I don't know. I mean, I love Casablanca, but I'm not going to say Casablanca because that's a film that really, frankly, everybody should see. It's really still a super important film. Or I could talk about the film I liked best last year or whatever, but it's likely to be a film that a lot of people have seen. So I usually try to dig up something that
obscure,
almost no one, I could pretty well guarantee no film student will have seen. So if I pick a film like Battle of Algiers, which is a film made by Pontecorvo, who is an Italian director who didn't make a lot of films. He was a perfectionist, and also he made really challenging films about difficult subjects, and so he didn't make a lot of feature films. He did a lot of commercials, which is kind of interesting because he didn't really care about the commercials. So I think that's why he said in interviews, you know, I can make commercials because I don't really care. You know, I'm working for hire. But he only made a handful of features. But The Battle of Algiers was a film he made in the 60s, and it's about the Algerian Revolution, and it's actually about the very violent, difficult years of resistance that drove the French out of colonial Algeria, leading to Algerian independence. That's a tough topic, especially in the 21st century where terrorism is such a part of our daily news cycle. To go back and look at this film that deals with trying to represent that kind of terrorism before it was really an everyday topic.
Yeah.
And it's a very controversial film. I mean, in France, it's not very well received by a lot of people because it very much takes the side of the Algerians.
Right.
But to the point, and this is a long-winded answer, but the story for me is an extraordinary story because it's both a fascinating story. I mean, it does have a story at the heart of it. It's not just this
just battle.
It's
epic.
not just this epic tableau of revolutionary fighting. It follows the story of one guy in particular, and it's a great story because this guy was sort of a petty thief. He wasn't the kind of person who would become you wouldn't think of him as becoming a heroic figure. And it follows this very humble, very flawed guy through his journey to becoming a quote unquote, whether you depending on what side you're on, a terrorist or a freedom fighter. And so my favorite stories are stories that are like that are really, they're not just, you know, they don't just sort of like check boxes of like on your if you get your screenplay, how to write a good screenplay book, and it's got, you know, well, have a good inciting conflict, and then...
Oh, the classic arc of the hero's journey?
You know. I'm not saying those things aren't valid, but I'm just saying that's not what I'm not sitting there looking just for something that just says, it's a perfect formula of the heroic journey. This film, and I think most of the films that are stories that I find most interesting are the ones that have a lot of complexity and really challenge us. And sometimes it actually take a while for us to get. I mean, it's not my favorite film, but like a film like Alfred Hitchcock's Vertigo.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll be honest, the first time I watched that film, I just came out of the theater, I was like, what the heck was that? I mean, I didn't really get it. And it's a really weird film on a lot of levels. It's sort of about sexual obsession, and I found it very off-putting. And it took me watching it a couple of times before I began to appreciate what was going on there.
Right.
So I think a lot of times good stories are like that. They are like something that kind of burrows into your brain.
As opposed to just hitting you right in the face, like I'm the story and
right.
You're just sort of taking it for what it is.
Yeah.
When I was taking your class, my aesthetic sensibilities increased tenfold. Because before that I would, and this is a fascinating discussion that I remember from the class that we did. You asked us, what do you mean by beauty?
Oh, yeah.
And it was a really polarizing topic because people had different ideas. Someone said, what is good is beautiful. Beautiful is what you see. Someone said, you know, beauty is in the eyes of the beholder. And I remember thinking, you know, beauty is whatever highlights the ugly. Like when you have beauty, you just sort of see the contradiction. It's like, okay, why do you say something's beautiful? It's because you've seen ugly, so you know what is beautiful, right? So I started doing that, and one of the things you have us do in the class is take us through a variety of visual mediums. So it's not just everyone sitting there watching a film. You make us watch paintings from, you know, everywhere from the 13th century till now, right? Then you make us watch how comic books are made, right? Then you even make us watch photographs. And then you make us, view other kinds of visual mediums which are not necessarily film, but which are sort of parts of the whole, right? And in that process, I took down all the posters in my room because they were all like mass-produced stuff that you find on Amazon, and I started rebuilding my collection based on some of the pictures you showed us in class, their symbolic nature, and I started printing them from Mughal so that I could, get it for free. And now what I have is none of them have slogans. None of them have an obvious motif that you would find in a college student's apartment. The common themes about coffee, alcohol, sports teams. You can sort of get an idea when you go and see someone's art in their room that what they're about. But now there are all these symbolic images. They're everything from a serpent, and in an abstract manner. There's some epic battles happening. Then there's that image that you made us watch in class. I forgot the one in Yellowstone National Park. At the end, there's a small light. I forgot what the artist is.
Oh, Alfred. Sorry, no, that's actually in Yosemite.
Oh, Yosemite.
But
My
the,
bad.
the
My bad.
Bierstadt. Alfred. I think Albert Bierstadt
Yeah,
was a
Albert
19th,
Bierstadt.
19th century
Yeah.
painter. Yes, his stuff is very epic. Vast.
Yeah.
And somewhat sort of romanticized views of the landscape. Yes.
It's funny that he did that in 1890. Like, I wonder what kind of animals might have been there when he did that.
Well, people should go and check out his work. That's a good example where that I think that kind of painting. Some people, they're gonna love it. It just fits their aesthetic. Other people are gonna go, particularly if they have sort of lean towards modern art, they'll look at it and go, this is so schmaltzy. What could one discover in a picture like this? But I think that when you look into what Bierstadt was doing, he was a very much part of his age. I always say he was like the Steven Spielberg of his age.
Right.
Because this is, of course, before films existed, and he was sort of making these blockbusters. The difference was his blockbusters were made with canvas and oils.
Yeah.
That picture from Yosemite, it may have been painted, I don't think it was the 1890s. I think it was painted in the 1870s or 80s, but he was in Yosemite in the 1840s, I believe.
Wow.
So the thing is, he took sketches. 30 years later, he was still painting those places. So actually, what you're seeing in that painting, there's a reason why it has a bit of a dreamlike quality, because it's actually a recollected image that he did based on...
So it's reproduced from memory?
From sketches.
Okay.
He took extensive sketches. But it's still extraordinary to think that we're talking about a 25-year lapse or something like that. He did, for much of his career, he kept revisiting sketches that he had done as a young man.
Mm-hmm.
But he was in New York City painting those things.
That's crazy. I thought that he had just sat down in Yosemite one day, in between the mountains and just started painting it.
No.
That's crazy. I was reading this article about Da Vinci and how he and his disciple, who was it? I believe Michelangelo.
Mm-hmm. They were actually sort of...
combative?
Not exactly, but I mean, they were sort of competing, yeah.
Yeah. He had this thing where he had trained his visual memory so much that him and some of the great masters of his time could just reproduce images from their head, and they would be exact copies. But coming back to my question, it's like, how can someone who's just sort of starting out and has the buzzword in their head, film production, short film, filmmaker, hashtag black sweater, something like that, how can someone like that start developing their aesthetic sensibilities and capabilities and start getting into this?
Well, like I say, I mean, I think that going out there and looking at film is really important. Mm-hmm. And I do think it's important to look beyond a little bit to your point about sort of dorm rooms having a certain similarity. You can't just go by what happens to be most accessible.
Right.
The first thing that pops up in your Netflix, like now trending.
Yeah.
Well, if it's trending, it means everybody's watching it.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean that's what you should be watching. Maybe it is. I mean, I'm not a snob. I mean, I want to see everything to some extent. But there also are only 24 hours in the day, and you only have so many years allotted to you. So I think it is important to try to get out there and see work that maybe is a little bit off the beaten path. Mm-hmm. If you're looking at making short films, I think it is important to look at short films, because what you can do in a short film is different from a feature.
Right.
So if you set out to make sort of a condensed feature, that's going to be a failure. Right? It just doesn't work.
Yeah.
So if you're trying to make a 5-minute film, it's like the difference between writing a novel versus writing a sonnet.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that 5-minute film is a sonnet. It's very limited in terms of its time the time that you have to make your point. And the same rules in a way, if you think about a sonnet, by that I mean a short poem, doesn't have to take you on some enormous journey. In fact, it doesn't even have to necessarily have a complete sense of closure. a poem can kind of leave you with a question.
Yeah.
And you're okay. It was 14 lines long, It's not like you invested hours or days into getting there, So their rules are different. And I think the only way you can really get a feel for that is by looking at a lot of work.
Yeah. Talking about looking at a lot of work, so I just sort of want to bring up, you've had a pretty long journey, like coming here, and you've made a bunch of stuff before. And I had the privilege of seeing your blog, Second Curly Cousin.
Yeah, second cousin Curly.
Second Cousin Curly.
That was sort of an experiment that I did about starting almost 10 years ago.
Yeah. And you did that, and I also saw your film Performance Anxiety with your son. I thought that was really interesting. It sort of seemed to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, a sort of self-portrait of what you would actually do in real life.
Oh, that was true.
Yeah,
because
it's like you're sort of exploring the relationship between yourself as the father of a gifted musician, and you want to train him and nurture him a certain kind. But before all of that, like, could you talk about like your background, how you, like, when you were born, how did you get into film, and all the things that led up to this point?
I'll try to make it not super long. It's been a long journey, you're right, but I'll try to condense it. Well, I was born and raised in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, which is still the home of University of North Carolina.
Yeah.
And when I was growing up, I didn't know anybody who was a filmmaker. I mean, I knew a lot of really smart people. I knew various interesting people, including some artists and so forth, but I didn't know anybody who was doing film in Chapel Hill. I never saw a movie camera. I didn't even see home movie cameras. Like,
wow.
People did have, this is before video, but people did have Super 8 cameras and things like that. My family didn't have one. I didn't really know anybody who had one. The way I got interested in film was because in those days, this was a time when on campuses, there were a lot of student film societies. They still exist some places, but nowhere near the way they did back, a long time ago. This really started in the 60s.
Okay.
Now I am an old guy, but that would have been early for me even. But by the time I was a teenager, I'm dating myself, but in the 70s, there was this very robust, well-developed film culture. And it wasn't just
in your hometown.
Not just Chapel Hill. Any university campus, any university campus of any size would have had sort of the film geeks. And I'm not talking about filmmakers. I'm not talking about film school. I'm just talking about just enthusiasts. And this was true all over the world, by the way. I mean, I met people when I did go to film school. I met people, in fact, from India. They had the same experience. They had gone to film societies and so forth in Mumbai or wherever they were from, and that was true in France. It was true anywhere. To a large extent. And so I was able to go to the university campus as a teenager. I mean, I wasn't a university student. And I would go to every screening I could, And so I got introduced to, and of course I saw the films that were in the movie theaters as well, but this way I got a really broad film education.
Yeah.
And that was a tremendous asset for me. So
this was like in your late teens, college age?
Yeah, I mean, I started doing that when I was about 14. I started going to a lot of films.
Wow, so as a 14-year-old, you would go to college campuses and get in touch with these film societies.
Yep. I remember very clearly, 14, 15, I started going. I'd get like a pass to the film society, and I'd show up and I'd see whatever was being shown, and that was all the stuff coming from Europe, from other parts of the world sometimes as well. So it was a really important. That was like that fundamental film education that I got there.
That's such a different first exposure to the world of film than from an average person, where you're born and your family is like, oh, let's go to the movies, and then you keep going to the movies throughout your life, and that's all you know. But you're someone who's going to these film societies as an enthusiast and someone who has a lot of enthusiasm for film. In between these people.
I mean, it's not as unusual as I was very lucky because I was in a university town, and Chapel Hill wasn't a huge town, so you could literally walk to campus.
Okay.
So I was lucky that way. But a lot of people discovered what I discovered maybe a little later when they got to university. But that scene, that time in the 60s and 70s, it really, when video came along in the 80s, it did sort of kill the whole scene.
Yeah.
But and to say nothing of then cable and all those things. But if you go and talk to a lot of people of my generation, maybe a little older than me, a lot of them have some version of that story, that they got exposed to a wide variety of international cinema through these various clubs and film clubs, things like that.
Right.
But I want to jump just because to sort of give the big picture. The thing is, what I want to stress is that even though I got a great sort of grounding in what film could be, all different types of filmmaking, I didn't have a clue how to be a filmmaker. And there was nobody that I could follow as a model. And as I said, I couldn't even see where I could get my hands on a camera.
Yeah.
So I didn't do anything to move actively towards being a filmmaker throughout, never mind my teenage years. I got through college, through university, and I really had never taken, the only film courses I took, I spent a year in France, in Paris. And in Paris, they already had a very, well-developed sort of film school culture in Paris.
Yeah.
And so I was able to take my very first film courses in Paris. But it was really only once I got out of university, and then I started thinking to myself, well, if I want to be a filmmaker, I really better take some steps towards doing that.
Yeah.
So then I went to film school. So I actually went to film school as a graduate student.
At USC?
Yeah, at USC. And that was so just to kind of carry the narrative, the interesting thing was, so here I was this guy who had seen, films by Ingmar Bergman or Mizoguchi or, all these greats of international cinema. Then you get to USC. USC was considered, rightly, I think in many respects, was considered, excuse me, was considered kind of a Hollywood trade school.
Oh, so big screens, glitz, glamour.
Well, it's also about whatever's going on in Hollywood at that time. That was what everybody was into.
Right.
Which at that time would have been, we were coming just in the wake of George Lucas and Star Wars and Steven Spielberg becoming a really big blockbuster director. And so there was all this sort of, this was the 80s. It was a time where, to some extent, that was the beginning of the whole blockbuster film economy that we still live in, where so much of the money that studios make is determined by just a handful of really huge films.
Yeah, like the Avengers franchise
right.
is one example.
Well, that was, you can say in a way that started with Star Wars.
Okay.
And so I came into USC as that was all taking hold. And for me, that was like, it was as though I had landed on another planet. I mean, I was like, I had no understanding at all of that. But sometimes that's a good thing to have that happen to you, because you either have to pack and leave, or if you stay, you have to kind of adjust. You have to open yourself up to a whole new set of ways of thinking about something. So I stayed, and I spent 3 years at USC, and I got this sort of quote-unquote Hollywood film school education, but it was a very good, in terms of technical stuff, they were very, very good about teaching all that stuff. And it did open me up to a whole different way of thinking about storytelling and films and all that. And, I didn't totally swallow the Kool-Aid. I didn't become a Hollywood film director, but I certainly got a different perspective on filmmaking from that. So when I was done with film school, there was sort of a major decision that had to be made, which is, do I stay here or do I go? And I decided to go back to the East Coast, which is where I was from. I actually did some educational filmmaking in North Carolina, my home state. And then I moved to New York City.
Yeah.
And I arrived in New York City just as the independent film scene that became a very big deal in the 1990s, that was just beginning to really happen.
Okay.
And so I'm trying to compress all this.
Please.
But
take your time.
But I got involved with some other eager people who were interested in independent filmmaking, and we had a company. That's the company you referenced when you were giving my bio briefly, the Alto Rock Films.
Yeah.
We had a group of partners together. We helped produce several features, one of which I directed. But we had a hand in several features. We partnered with some other companies to help them make features, and so through the 90s, there I was very involved with the independent film scene in New York. And then eventually I got married. My wife was in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And then the question was, well, which of us is going to move? One of us is going to have to move. And we simply looked at the job opportunities. And I got lucky. A job opened up at BU that really fit me well.
Yeah.
And that brought me here. And we can talk more. I mean, I think that's a good place to stop. But I got to BU. I've been very involved in film education, needless to say, the whole time I've been at BU. But I have continued to do various kinds of production. What was harder for me to do was to do the kind of feature directing, that kind of thing. It was, for a lot of reasons, it was hard to keep doing that while I was teaching full time.
Right.
So I've tended to do more short stuff and things like that, or had a hand in helping other people get films launched. But you know, that's just a trade-off I had to make. I mean, I love teaching. Of course, I would love to be doing other long-form, ambitious productions, but there's a zero sum. You know,
For sure. Yeah.
You have to
That's
make
the
it
opportunity cost.
You have to make it work. Yeah.
Yeah. Talking about teaching at BU, you know, moving away from just being in your own sort of independent space of creating films and producing films to now teaching young budding enthusiasts of film on how to make films. What's the big takeaways?
I mean, the thing that I still look for is, I guess I see my students falling into a few different categories. There are students who are simply passing through my class, and I don't mean to take them lightly. In fact, I would say maybe they're the most important group of students. They're the ones who aren't going to be filmmakers.
Yeah.
They're going to go off into, they don't know yet. They could end up being doctors or real estate agents or who knows.
Anything else, yeah.
But I hope that they get something from my class because, you know, as you said about this quote, I say that, you know, you have a choice between being a producer of content or just a consumer.
Yeah.
We all have the wherewithal, the resources nowadays to be producers. And in some way, let's say you're a real estate agent, you have to have video to sell your properties and so forth.
Absolutely,
and so
yeah.
Everything we do is all driven by content nowadays. So having the ability to control that is a super powerful thing. So I look at what I'm giving my students at a base level. I'm giving them some really useful tools for life. Okay, that's one group. Then another group are the people who are they're really talented filmmakers, but they may not have the drive or whatever it is that is going to fuel them to go out there and have, you know, a big career as a writer, director, something like that.
Yeah.
Many students I've had have made spectacular films that I still look at and I just think, wow. I mean, everything about it just, you know, I've show examples in my production one class of short films that still just, they just blow me away that somebody had the creativity and the smarts to think through the choices that they made are always extraordinary. But when I look at those names, a lot of them are people who went on not necessarily to be the big titans of industry.
Yeah.
You know, they might go off, again, they might just pursue different careers altogether and go off into international relations or who knows what. But some of them do go into filmmaking, but more in a craft area, like they become editors or they become, you know, they find a niche for themselves. And then the final category there's some students who are they're just on fire. I mean, they have this drive, you know, that is unstoppable. And that's actually, needless to say, in all walks of life, that's fairly unusual. I mean, I'm talking about somebody who would walk over hot coals to
get that done.
Get something done, you know. But those people, when you meet those people, you know, unless they self-destruct somehow, they usually end up getting something.
Which is really common amongst creatives. Self-sabotage is a big trait.
It can be. I mean, there's some sad cases I know of like that. But I've also seen some people who have gone very far who are that kind of, they're just kind of unstoppable. And so those are the three categories. But in terms of my role, the people I worry about the least are that last group.
Yeah.
Because those
They're gonna
guys,
be fine.
they always take care. They get it done, you know.
Yeah.
They don't even need, our program. I mean, we're happy to teach them, and they'll learn something along the way, but they're going to get there. It's the other two groups that I focus a lot on.
Right. I happen to be in the first group because I know for a fact that I'm not going to produce film, but all the lessons that I've taken from your class, literally, because I produce online content, has, let's just say, using colloquial language, has upped my content game tremendously. I get questions all the time, like, how are you able to structure these things together? How are you able to, like, produce and put out stuff every single day? What's your process like? And I'm like, I can't tell you that. But it's because of the tools that I've learned in your class, right? It's like how to cut things together, how to piece them together, how to have a narrative, all of those things. So, I mean, yeah, thank you so much. Like, thank you so much for caring for Group 1, because Group 1 is thankful to you for making that happen. But no, so talking about teaching further, and what's some of the myths that people have, especially what I think is interesting is, and correct me if I'm wrong, there's this sort of almost like a push and pull between the more traditional requirements of being a filmmaker and producing stuff for film, and the more instantly gratifying way of producing content online, right? And it's like, how do you fuse the two together? Because me personally, I find it hard to just sit down patiently and think over a long-term project and think about executing it over 3 months and then coming out with a piece that's finished. It's almost like the demands of the day are requiring me to produce stuff now and just pump out. How do you marry the two together?
Well, that was one of the reasons I did Second Cousin Curly, which I'm not trying to sell it to people, because I actually stopped feeding that blog about 5 years ago. And one of the reasons I stopped was because it was absolutely relentless. I had to keep producing content. I did about 100, I would say at least 100 videos and maybe a few more posts than that over the 5-year period. And I had to wrestle with that, because even as a professional filmmaker, to try to produce just on my own, produce polished, fully formed, fully thought out content on that pace every 2 weeks or so, putting out video content and then writing also an article to go with it. It was crushing. One of the things I was trying to do was kind of force myself away from the way of working that is natural for somebody who comes from my background as a filmmaker. I mean, I'm talking about shooting film. When I came up, I was shooting film. Film costs a fortune to shoot. So you're never going to push the shutter on a film camera until you know exactly what you are going for. And then you're going to sweat over every frame of it when you're editing it, because you're not going to want to put out there anything that isn't exactly what's needed. And that still is sort of how I think that's a very valuable outlook to have that way of, that sort of sense of craft. But one of the things about living in sort of the YouTube era is that you can just sort of throw something up there and see what happens, see if people are interested. I mean, you have that relationship with your viewers and listeners. Let's put it out there and see what happens, right? So I tried to sort of avail myself of that spontaneity. I think there is something to that, but what's hard is it's very hard to go from being somebody who just works in sort of the YouTube world, which is like you turn a camera on, maybe your phone on, and you
start talking.
You start following yourself around. You're talking about hiking equipment or whatever your thing is. And you put that stuff up there, and it's very immediate, and it's very hard to go from that to screen language.
The other side,
to real screen language, where you're using kind of all the sophisticated possibilities. I had a student a year or two ago. He had a vlog, video blog, where he put up pretty much every day. He put up content. And this guy wasn't just some guy with an iPhone. He had a really nice camera.
Was his name Arlen Moore?
Yeah, Arlen.
Yeah. I've seen his blog, and he's got a pretty decent following on Instagram as well.
Yes, I mean, he has followers and everything, but it was interesting working with him, because what he was doing, which was essentially kind of documenting his daily journey, albeit trying to make it into sort of a something that had a bit of a narrative to it. I mean, I think, in other words, I think he was very aware of the fact that it wasn't going to be that interesting if he wasn't
Talk
trying to
about
just
it,
put
yeah,
unedited reality up there on screen. But what was interesting working with him was that, there's a world from getting from that to a fully formed, crafted, shaped, edited narrative. That's a very different thing. And I'm of the school, I believe, that while being able to move the camera, for example, is a extremely important skill, and it's something that, one of the things movies do is they move. To be able to move the camera is a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
But if you go from that to, so the coolest thing we can do is just follow somebody around with a camera,
Yeah.
that is usually poison for filmmaking. Because what you leave out there is one of the other most powerful things films can do. You've heard me talk about this, which is cut. When you juxtapose two images against each other, there's all kinds of possibilities that happen there. And a lot of what you see out there in terms of, kind of YouTube content is basically, one shot where they just cut parts of the shot out. And that's a world away from the kind of sophisticated screen language where you have all sorts of different perspectives and things like that, and cut together sequences, and maybe you have montages, and all those possibilities, all that stuff. So this is a long answer, but I mean
that was a beautiful insight, because I didn't think about that at all. One of the things that sort of came to me when you were saying that is, for the content that's put out on YouTube and Instagram, you have immediate social feedback. And what starts to happen is, as you're navigating the whole content space, you then start incorporating, what do the people want? You start incorporating, I got more viewer attention on this one and less on this one. What did I do right in that one? What did I do wrong in this one? So in a way, you're sort of giving value to the input of others far more than your own one, and which makes sense, because again, you're serving a social platform, right? At the same time, though, I think what's radically different with just the professional craft of filmmaking is that you only get that input once, and that's when you actually screen the film for people and they watch it and they say, I liked it, it was like this and that may or may not inform the next thing you make. So that is like radically different from just having a constant social feedback.
Yeah, it's different. It's cool to be able to get the kind of ongoing feedback you get through YouTube. I mean, that's one of the things I really found fascinating about doing my blog was that to whatever extent I heard from people, it was completely different from, I'd spent my whole career up to that point. As you say, you made a film, you put it out there. The thing is, this is actually more true. If you make a little independent film, you actually will go to a lot of film festivals. I mean, some films of mine I took to a lot of festivals, and I got to actually have the benefit of hearing different audiences react differently to them. Performance Anxiety is an example of that. I showed that film several places, and I could go see it and get these different responses. But if you think of somebody like Ryan Coogler or somebody, like a big current director, the guy who did Black Panther.
Yeah.
If he wants, he can go to the Cineplex and see how people are liking his movie. But the reality of it is that all those millions of people who are seeing his work, he, for the most part, doesn't really hear directly from them,
Yeah.
So you're right. That's a really different thing about the social media aspect of YouTube or Vimeo or Instagram or whatever. And I think that's really interesting, that ability to have this dialogue.
Yeah.
Because that, if you can talk to many filmmakers will lament the fact that they so seldom actually get the experience. It's not like, this is also why a lot of actors will choose to work in the theater, even though they make much less money than working in film, because every night that they get up there on stage, they know what the audience is thinking about their work.
Because they can see it in real time.
Yeah. But, if your career is mostly in the cinema, you don't really get that that experience.
So one of the questions that came to me, and we're going to wrap up in like 15 minutes because I know you have to leave, was that I obviously have a lot of friends, and I think this is true particularly for our generation, of the people who want to produce content online, and alluding back to your quote. Um, you showed us a storyboarding app in class which helps you, how to make storyboards so you're not just going to set or going to your location on the day of and thinking, oh, maybe we could shoot that thing from that angle, and spending all that time brainstorming when you have restrictions on how much time you can use on the set, and you've paid people and there's other things, logistics. So what are some of the apps or tools that young people can use to sort of plan ahead for their production?
Oh, I'm not going to be, believe it or not, even though we do that
Yeah.
class. I just recently, my colleague Jamie Kompaneshki has come, as you know,
Yeah.
he's come many times to talk to my classes, and he's looked a lot deeper than I have into what's out there. I know one app that Jamie likes a lot that he uses. We demonstrated in classes. It's an app called Shot Designer.
Shot Designer.
And it's free. I mean, the basic model of it is free. You can spend a whopping $20, I think, in 1995 or something, and then you get a version where you can put it on your desktop and also use it on your phone and so forth.
Yeah.
So it has some more. It unlocks a few features, but basically it's free. It's really pretty remarkable. I mean, it's mostly there to give you a way to do overhead diagrams where you can see where you'd place people and where you'd put the camera, but you can also integrate storyboards and all kinds of lists of the shots that you're as you're designing them. It keeps track of how many shots you've designed and so forth. So it's a really, what I like about it is it's not flashy. It's what you need. It gives you the things you really need.
Right.
There are some, speaking of flashy, like I had a student this semester who showed me an app, and unfortunately I can't remember the name of it. It was new to me.
Okay.
But it was, I mean, you could design these shots that looked like,
Real life.
Real life, and also, spectacularly, it was like a summer blockbuster scene that you're designing on your phone. And that was a pricier app, but my concern there is that it's all well and good to design that, but I don't want it to be like playing a video game. I mean, I want it to be giving me a chance to work out what I need to shoot.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, I have to figure out how to make a camera do these things, so that if I come up with something that looks too cool.
Yeah. You don't want to raise our expectations.
Well, I mean, are you going to actually be able to pull that off?
Yeah.
I want something that will actually help me get what I really need. And so yeah, Shot Designer is really good. But there certainly are other things out there. But I would emphasize, one of the reasons I don't know these apps so well is that I've actually always gotten by pretty well I just use storyboard forms where I just draw. I mean, I'm a reasonably good artist with my hand, so I've always been able to do that. And literally, I just print up on sheets of paper some storyboards. It's important that they be in the right aspect ratio, meaning the shape of the frame should be the same frame that you're planning to shoot in.
Yeah.
Once you've done that, it's just a matter of sitting down and mapping out your shots. I'm a big believer in overhead diagrams, shooting from over, keeping track of what I'm doing using an overhead diagram of my set. And one of the reasons you mentioned, you have a limited amount of time and you want to plan, but it's also all this stuff we've been talking about in terms of the grammar of shots.
Yeah.
I've been doing this for decades, and I'm still very capable of making huge mistakes when it comes to not getting all the shots I need to be able to put together a sequence where everything kind of fits in a logical way. And the only way I can really keep a sense of what it is I need is by mapping it out.
Great. What's one thing that you would like young creatives, filmmakers, and artists to know that you've learned, either from painful experience or just years of working with others in film?
Wow, there are a lot. I don't know that it's the one thing.
Could be three.
Well, one thing that that I don't think that I always have done myself, that I try to tell myself to do this, so I would tell everybody else this. And that is that I think maybe not everybody has the problem I have, but I think my whole life I've tended to think about the big thing that I wanted to say. So I wanted to make a film that, was about a certain theme, or that took on some topic, some kind of big idea. And that's actually not usually a great way to tell a story.
Interesting.
It doesn't matter if you're telling a story about if you say, well, I want to tell a story about man's inhumanity to man. I mean, that's not a good story. I mean, the story starts with a man is out of work and he's walking through the night.
Yeah.
Looking for a job and a place to sleep. And then something happens. I mean, that's the way a story starts. It's a series of incidents. And if you come into it pasting onto it this huge sort of outcome.
Yeah, this almost deliberate imposition of what you want it to be.
Right. I mean, it's going to be about, that story's going to be about the fundamental, the human price of capitalism.
Yeah.
Like, it's a perfectly valid thing to explore that. Some great films have been made about that get into that. But if you start from a position that we're going to do a film about the human cost of capitalism, there's a word for. I mean, that's propaganda. It's like it's driven by that idea. I'm not saying that's a good idea, bad idea in terms of politics, but I'm just saying that's not a great way to go about telling a story. I think we always have to remind ourselves that at the beginning, they're just people and incidents, places, and it's the interaction of those things. And then, is what happens interesting? Is it surprising? Is it revealing? Does it reveal something about the people? And if you follow that as your lodestar, as your guide, you will always come up with ultimately something much more rewarding.
Yeah. I never thought of that. Actually, I have the same problem. I always think, hey, let me make something about this one theme that I'm passionate about. Could be just a piece of writing, because I write as well, and it tends to, it starts betraying the structure in which people would understand it, and it starts taking on a form of how I would understand it. And that's the hard thing, is you wanna put it in a structure in which the story happens and the theme or the main lesson emerges out in the background as like a subtle thing, or it could be a pretty direct thing, but it just happens. Like it doesn't hit you in the face. I am this, and you are watching this. Because you get invested in the story, so you forget because now you're in the story, and then it's So
I mean, I think that a lot of the most extraordinary films, and by the way, it's no surprise. What I'm saying here about storytelling, it applies absolutely whether you're writing a novel or writing a short story or making a film. But I do think some of the great filmmakers, they're like, I mean, I mentioned Hitchcock's film Vertigo.
Yeah.
I once read in some screenwriting book that they said, you have to have a basic concept. It should be your story should be about something simple. Like, take Vertigo. It's about a man who has a fear of heights. That is not what Vertigo is about. I urge your listeners and viewers to go and watch it. It's not about a man. Yes, he has some vertigo at the beginning of the film, meaning he gets a little dizzy when he's standing on a stool. That's not what the film is about. In fact, it's exactly the point that it's about almost anything but that. It's like that's just the entry point into a film that's about our darkest motives and what really the passions that drive us into dark places. And I think Hitchcock had a lot of really dark motives himself. I mean, it's been documented biographies about him.
Really?
He was a pretty kinky guy, yes, and very much kind of a little bit of a predator. I'm not saying any of this is good,
Yeah.
but his film is like, it's like he's going there, and I don't think he knew.
Oh.
I don't think he went in there saying, I'm going to make a film about sexual obsession.
Yeah.
I think he said, I'm going to make a film about a guy who has this accident and it completely upends his world, and then this happens and this happens and this happens, and he just followed that where it led him, and it led him into this really dark exploration of the human psyche. But you don't start by saying, let's do a dark exploration of the human psyche.
That's funny. Wow. That's so crazy. So you think that most of these filmmakers who tend to make these, let's just say, dark or light films tend to be just exposing parts of their psyche? Like they don't know about it, but they just go on this journey, and that's what emerges?
I think it's about telling a story, and then the themes should emerge organically from them. That's the ideal. I recognize that any smart person is going to start realizing, hey, I'm exploring these themes as they're going along, but you have to kind of keep reminding yourself that at the end of the day, it's about what are the events of the story. And many times when I'm working with students, when I'm talking to them about their story idea, I'll say, well, why does this guy jump up and run out of the restaurant? And they say, well, because I'm telling a story about, anxiety. I don't know. And I say, but why does he do that? I mean, let's deal with the facts of the story, and then we'll worry about what you're trying to say about, about the human condition.
So as someone who's trying to, climb the huge mountain of film and just starting out, and they want to be a producer, and that producer could be anywhere from a short filmmaker, a content producer, a writer, an artist, a painter. I think one of the things that tends to be characteristic, and I'm not saying that's true for everyone, because there are extroverted and self-confident creatives, but a lot of creatives, when they're starting out, they suffer from this thing called self-doubt, and you've been able to sustain your film career for the longest time, and you certainly teach it. What's like your own strategy to overcome it, and have you ever had to face it?
Oh my goodness! I mean, I think it's one of the reasons I don't tend to look back at my work, because I just don't. I have all kinds of questions about everything I do, and there's very little that I do that I just feel like, that's. I stand by that, Yeah. Oh my gosh. No, I have a lot of questions about my own work. Always. Yeah.
That's a relief to hear, because I think that people who establish themselves have their shit together completely.
Oh gosh, no. Oh man, no. That's why the self-help industry in Hollywood is very healthy, economically. I mean,
7 ways to change your life.
Right. No, they're. I mean, that's why I'm being serious here. Actually, it's why stuff like Scientology. Mm-hmm. It's why it has a lot of adherents in Hollywood, because Scientology is this weird. I think it's weird. Sorry, I'll go out on a limb there. I do think it's a weird religion. I'm not even sure it really counts. It's a cult or whatever. But the point is, it's basically a kind of. It's all founded on sort of a self-help principle.
Yeah.
The fundamentals of Scientology, we don't have to go into this, is a whole different.
It's like you can ascend through different levels.
Yeah, but it's all about sort of self-realization.
Yeah.
I mean, it appeals to those insecure creatives. It gives them something they can hold on to and a path. I get it. I get why they go there. But anyway, so there's plenty of people who have those doubts. And I've never been one to. I never went for Scientology. I don't tend to go for those kind of answers, but it's challenging. It's challenging.
Yeah.
I will say this, and again, I speak as somebody who has not always been able to do this.
Okay.
I once worked with a guy who was a photographer primarily. He did some filmmaking too, but he was a photographer, a very gifted fine art photographer. And he did all kinds of interesting photographic work. And I happened to be sharing an office with him when everything in his life was unraveling. He was losing his job. His marriage was falling apart. He was having a relationship with a young woman that wasn't working out. Everything was going wrong.
Yeah.
And I would ask him what he did, what'd you do over the weekend? Oh, I was in the dark room the whole weekend. He was working, creatively working the whole time.
Mm-hmm.
He never stopped. I just could not believe that. I mean, for me personally, I would have been so crippled by all these events in my life. I would have said, I can't go shoot pictures now. My wife just left me.
Yeah.
His wife leaves him. He's like, click, 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 click. He never stopped. He never stopped working. And I think for good or ill, that's a lot of real artists. That's what defines them, is they can't help themselves. They have to just keep doing it. And it's not to say this guy wasn't going through, he was crying at night or whatever, or going out and getting drunk to wash away his pain. I'm not saying he wasn't going through he wasn't denying that his life was falling apart. He knew that. But I'm just saying it didn't stop him from working.
He didn't abandon his vocation just because of all of this.
And moreover, somehow he just kept finding a way to express himself through his work the whole time he was doing that. And I've seen that over and over again with a lot of the artists I really admire, as just in terms of their method. That for them, there's no distinction between life and art. It's like breathing for them. And for me, that's, much as I've always been a person who's involved in the arts, I like all kinds of arts. I like drawing, I like painting, I like playing music. That's why I became a filmmaker, is because you can put all those things together.
Right, yeah.
And I my life, if I weren't artistically active in some way, I think I would go crazy. But that's still a little different than those people who have that compulsion to keep creating in a particular way. So I don't know that they're probably that's not to say that every even successful filmmaker falls into that camp.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that. I think there are plenty of us who struggle to figure out what we're going to do next.
Right.
But it's a wonderful gift if you have that compulsion to create like that.
Funny that you say that. And I'm just going to say this thing, and then we'll end it because you have to go. I worked for a director, a very famous director in India. He's an indie film director this summer, and I worked in casting for him. And I also attended some writers' room sessions with him, and I was kicked out because, obviously I was young and enthusiastic, and I blurted out all my ideas without, realizing the level of esteemed people I was sitting in the room with, people with 10, 15 years of experience. And then I watched an interview that he did with a journalist 2 years ago, and the journalist asked him, like, hey, why do you keep making films? You've lost so much money, like you've been in debt all this time. You just keep still making films. Like, what's the reason? He's like, I don't know. It's a disease. And what you just said just reminded me of that. It's like,
well, I said it was a gift.
Well, that's an interesting way of seeing it.
It's a gift. It's a disease. I could see how, if it's, because I think for some of those people, it's a horrible. Their costs. They can get deeply in debt. They can lose partners who can't. Because to live with somebody.
But I think he meant it in a positive way. It's like he said it. There's like a bug in my brain that's like a disease bug. It keeps making me do these things. Yeah.
Yeah, I just think some people are wired that way. Yeah. Yeah, and I think like I said, it's not something you can probably will. It's like your nature. You either are that way or you're not. I don't think I could become that guy that I shared an office with. He was a different creature from me.
Yeah.
But I do think that there are artists like that, and I've always kind of been in awe of them. Yeah.
That's great. Well, Professor Merzbacher, thank you so much for taking the time and coming to the Vitruvian Man podcast. We are deeply honored. I think you're our most important guest. And, Madhav was all praise about you. He's like, better ask him all the film questions you can because this is our time. So thank you so much. Can I just get your book for a sec?
Yes. Sure.
So you guys can buy The Short Guide to Producing Films on Amazon and Focal Press?
Well, so it's published by Focal Press, which is a branch of Routledge, Routledge is a very large publisher, international publisher.
Okay.
And if you go to theshortseries.com, there's a link to the places where you can get the book. But I also want to stress that theshortseries.com has a lot of information on it, and we'll be adding to that, and that's completely free. You don't have to buy a book or anything. You can just go visit there and see what we've got. We'll have some videos interviewing producers and so forth coming up soon, and a lot of content.
Yeah, I actually checked the website. It's a good introduction. It also has a pretty big case study about a whole film, so you can literally see in real time how you can start producing this. And yeah, you get the book. And Professor Merzbacher, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much. This was the Vitruvian Man podcast. One more question before we leave. If you want people to contact you about any questions, or where can they find you?
They can find me through the BU.
Okay, we'll put
email.
a link for that.
Yeah, and I don't mind if I have to close my email account because of this podcast. I'm coming to see you.
Yeah, please spam him. All right, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.